The Galactic Concorde's busiest spaceport was a symphony of languages, colors, and species, all flowing like a chaotic but rehearsed orchestra. Here, beneath the artificial light of a sky that never darkened, arrivals and departures pulsed in a ceaseless rhythm. Automated announcers translated across 1,000 tongues, baggage drones weaved through crowds, and the smell of synthesized meals mixed with the sterile hum of ionized air. It was here, among the travelers and traders, diplomats and drifters, that Alra found herself utterly lost. She was a frail thing, her exoskeletal plates too thin for her species' comfort, her bioluminescent freckles dimmer than the others of her kind. Among the proud Zalari, she was an anomaly, a girl too poor, too quiet, too wrong. Her parents had died years ago in an industrial accident on a backwater colony, and ever since she had been nothing more than a statistic, one of the forgotten masses, scraping by on station work and second-hand dreams. But today, everything was supposed to change. She clutched the data chip in her trembling hands, a ticket, an opportunity, a future. She had been accepted into the Interstellar Exchange Initiative, a program designed to integrate different species into each other's cultures. A full scholarship, passage to Terra, and a chance to study alongside humans, creatures known for their unpredictable nature, their kindness, their fury. Her antennae twitched nervously as she adjusted the travel-worn cloak draped over her shoulders. The instructions had been clear. Meet your assigned human host at Arrival Gate 42B. But the spaceport was a labyrinth, and the signs seemed to shift every time she thought she understood them. The bustle of the terminal swallowed her tiny form whole. Then she saw him, or rather, the back of him. Tall for his kind, broad-shouldered, with dark hair slightly tousled in the way humans often found fashionable. He stood near 42B, wearing the signature exchange program badge on his jacket. Relief flooded her. This was her host. Finally, something was going right. Without hesitation, Alra flung her thin arms around him in the traditional Zalari greeting, an embrace meant to signify trust. She felt the warmth of his body, the surprise in his breath. But the moment shattered. The human stiffened, turning slightly, and she realized her mistake. This was not her host. This was someone else. A heartbeat passed, then another. The world seemed to freeze around them. The wrong young human, whose name she would later learn was Adrian Solmir, tilted his head and looked down at her with an expression unreadable yet strangely intent. He was not some ordinary exchange student. The fine weave of his clothes, the insignia on his sleeve, he was wealthy, important. She had made a mistake. A costly one. And yet, instead of stepping back in confusion or brushing her away in disgust, Adrian Solmir did something unexpected. He smiled. Alra's bioluminescent freckles flickered weakly in a pattern of confusion and panic. Her kind couldn't blush, but the dimming of her glow was just as telling. Her trembling hands released the human's jacket, and she took a step back, her lower mandibles clicking in an unconscious display of distress. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her accent curling around the human words, the unfamiliar syllables sticking like burrs in her throat. "I thought you were." Adrian Somra's gaze stayed on her, unwavering, curious. He tilted his head slightly, dark eyes catching the sterile spaceport lights. Where most humans would have laughed off the mistake, brushed her aside, or moved on, he simply studied her, as if Alra were a particularly interesting puzzle. She had seen that expression before, from those who came from wealth and influence, those who had never been invisible a day in their lives. But this was different. There was no cruelty in it, only interest. "You're an exchange student, aren't you?" he asked finally, his voice smooth, practiced, like someone used to speaking where people listened. Aura forced herself to nod, barely trusting her voice. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Names were important. Among the Zalari, a name wasn't given lightly. It carried weight, history, expectation. A name could be a burden. "Aura," she said at last. A flicker of something crossed Adrian's face. He glanced at the data chip still clutched in her trembling fingers, then at the crowd shifting around them. She knew she should leave. Find the actual human she was assigned to. Fix this mistake before it spiraled into something worse. But Adrian Solmir was already making a decision. "Your assigned host," he said, his voice amused but unreadable. "They should be here by now, right?" Aura glanced around, her antennae twitching. The spaceport's crowd swallowed everything in a restless tide. Faces blurred into anonymity, and no one seemed to be searching for her. "Yes," she admitted softly. Adrian exhaled through his nose. The closest humans came to an exasperated sigh. "And yet they're not. You've been standing here, completely lost, and no one's come to claim you." It hadn't occurred to Aura to think of it that way. But now, standing beneath the scrutiny of someone who had probably never been forgotten, never been an afterthought, the realization settled like a cold weight in her chest. A sharp chime interrupted her, a station-wide announcement pulsing through the air. "Attention! Incoming students from the Interstellar Exchange Initiative, please proceed to Terminal Hub 6 for host verification. Repeat, all exchange students, Terminal Hub 6. That was her cue. That was where she should go. But Adrian Solmir was still looking at her. Then, with a slight smirk, too slight, too knowing, he took a step closer. "I'll walk with you." Aura's mandibles twitched. "You don't have to." "I want to." She hesitated. This wasn't supposed to be happening. The program was clear. Students met their assigned hosts. The rich and influential weren't involved in this kind of mundane process. And yet, Adrian had already turned, gesturing for her to follow. Against all her instincts, Aura obeyed. As they walked, the spaceport stretched around them. Glistening advertisement panels flashing in multiple languages, transit pods zipping above their heads, and a holo display overhead showing the galactic news. The human-Terran trade markets had stabilized after a recent diplomatic dispute. A Zalari dignitary was scheduled to meet with Earth's representatives. The universe churned forward, uncaring of a small, lost girl and the strange young man who had taken an interest in her. Aura kept her eyes down, hyper-aware of the weight of Adrian's presence beside her. "I've never met a Zalari in person before," he mused after a moment. She flicked a glance up at him, wary. "And?" He considered her, as if measuring his response. "You glow," he said finally, and there was something almost amused in the observation. Aura flinched. It wasn't a compliment. Not among her people. "Yes," she said stiffly, "but not brightly." He caught the bitterness in her voice. "Is that bad?" Her mandibles clicked softly. "To my kind?" "Yes." Adrian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the shifting lights of the terminal, as if turning over some thought in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. That's funny." "What is?" "I've always been told I shine too much." Aura frowned. "You, what?" He gave her a half-smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Being a Solmir means people watch you, expect things from you. Too much attention. Too much weight. You don't get to just be." Aura had no idea how to respond to that. They walked in silence after that, the echoes of the terminal dulling to a low hum around them. And yet, something had shifted. She had made a mistake today. She had hugged the wrong human. But something told her, something deep in the hollow of her chest, that this mistake was about to change everything. Terminal Hub 6 was a mosaic of species, each one distinct yet blending into the collective hum of anticipation and anxiety. Aura kept her head low, her antennae twitching nervously. Beside her, Adrian moved with a confidence that parted the crowd effortlessly, like a ship cutting through calm waters. As they approached the registration booth, a human attendant looked up, blinking in surprise at the sight of Adrian. His expression flickered between recognition and deference. "Mr. Solmere," the attendant stammered, "I didn't realize." "Just helping out," Adrian cut in smoothly, his tone betraying nothing. He gestured to Aura. "This student got separated from her group. Thought I'd make sure she got here all right." The attendant nodded vigorously, typing quickly into his console. "Of course. Let me just verify." His eyes darted to Aura, and she felt the familiar prick of judgment, the quick assessment of someone who didn't fit. "Name?" "Aura," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the din. A few keystrokes later, the attendant frowned. "It appears your assigned host hasn't arrived yet." He glanced nervously at Adrian. "Perhaps you'd like to wait here? We'll contact them immediately." Adrian's brow furrowed, a flicker of annoyance passing over his face. "How long will that take?" "Should be just a few minutes." Aura shifted uncomfortably, her thin fingers gripping the strap of her bag. She didn't want to cause trouble. Not here, not when she was so close to a fresh start. But standing beside Adrian felt like standing in the shadow of a supernova, the intensity of his presence threatening to consume her. "It's all right," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I can wait." Adrian, however, seemed to have other plans. He turned to her, his gaze softer than before. "You hungry?" "What?" The question caught her off guard. "Hungry," he repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know a place nearby. Let's grab something to eat while they sort this out." Aura hesitated. Accepting hospitality was serious among the Zalari. It meant trust, a bond. And yet, something in Adrian's eyes, something that flickered like a spark, made her nod. "Okay." The food court was a sensory overload. Scents of alien spices and roasted meats mingled with the sharp tang of recycled air. Hollow menus floated above kiosks, offering everything from Martian stew to Venery sweet cakes. Adrian led them to a quieter corner, where the noise of the crowd dulled to a murmur. As they sat, Aura found herself watching Adrian closely. His posture, the casual elegance of his movements, everything about him screamed privilege. And yet there was a weariness in his gaze, a shadow that lurked behind his polished exterior. "Have you ever tried Terran food before?" Adrian asked, breaking into her thoughts. She shook her head. "We only had nutrient paste on my colony." Her voice held a note of shame, and she looked away, embarrassed by the starkness of her own reality. Adrian ordered for them a variety of dishes that seemed excessive, but he insisted. As the plates arrived, Aura's antennae twitched with curiosity. She tasted cautiously, the flavors bursting on her tongue, a riot of sweet, savory, and bitter that she had never known. Adrian watched her with an odd intensity, as if trying to read her through her reactions. "It's good, right?" Aura nodded, swallowing a mouthful. "It's different." They fell into a comfortable silence, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation creating a cocoon around them. "So, why did you join the exchange program?" Adrian's question was casual, but his eyes betrayed a deeper interest. "To learn," she replied simply. "To find a better life." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "A better life," he echoed. "Isn't that what everyone wants?" Aura glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the soft lights above. "Isn't it?" A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Not when you're already living the best life money can buy." The words hung between them, a confession wrapped in cynicism. Aura studied him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed absently on the table. He seemed a contradiction, wealthy yet dissatisfied, powerful yet seeking something beyond his reach. Before she could respond, a beep interrupted them. Adrian checked his calm, his expression darkening. Your host finally showed up. Aura's heart sank. Reality was catching up to her. This moment, this strange connection, was about to end. She stood slowly, her limbs heavy. "Thank you for," she searched for the right words. "For helping." Adrian stood too, his gaze meeting hers. "No problem." But then, just as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Aura." She turned back, her eyes wide. "If you ever need help, real help, find me." There was something in his tone, something that promised more than just assistance. It was an invitation, an open door to a world she had only glimpsed through the cracks. She nodded, a soft glow returning to her freckles. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the flow of travelers and dreams. Adrian watched her go, a strange tightness in his chest. For once, he felt the weight of his own privilege, the emptiness of it. As he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this brief encounter was only the beginning of something much larger. Aura's new home was not a home. She had expected warmth, curiosity, perhaps even mild resentment from her host family. Instead, she was met with indifference, a quiet sort of neglect that settled like dust in the corners of their sterile, too-perfect residence. The Rains family was polite. The kind of politeness that functioned like a force field, keeping her at arm's length without ever being outright cruel. They had accepted an exchange student, it seemed, more out of obligation than desire. Mr. Rains barely looked at her. Mrs. Rains communicated mostly through terse, efficient messages sent to her calm. Their son, Callum, an older student, acknowledged her existence only when necessary, offering a few clipped words before retreating behind his music and his screen. So Aura learned quickly how to disappear. She memorized the layout of the house, noting which hallways creaked, which doors were best left unopened. She kept her things neatly stored in the small guest room they had given her, a space that felt more like a waiting area than a place someone lived. Her school assignments arrived via terminal. The program had promised integration, but she had yet to meet another student face to face. The first week passed in a blur of silent meals, dull lectures, and the ever-present weight of isolation pressing down on her ribs. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Perhaps something more welcoming. Perhaps something human. And yet, every night, as she lay staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, her mind drifted back to a boy with dark eyes and the lingering taste of unfamiliar food. She hadn't seen Adrian Solmir since that day at the spaceport. He belonged to a different world, a higher orbit she would never reach. Or so she thought. The message came unexpectedly, a soft chime from her comm as she sat in the Rains study, working through an economics lesson she barely understood. "Unknown ID, are you free?" Her antennae twitched in confusion. Who is this? A pause. Then, Adrian Solmere. Her fingers hesitated over the screen. Why was he messaging her? How had he even gotten her contact info? Another message. I want to show you something. Aura glanced at the closed door of the study, the faint sounds of the Rains family moving about their separate lives beyond it. She typed, "Now?" "Yes." "Meet me outside." Her heart stuttered. This was a bad idea. It had to be. But before she could talk herself out of it, her feet were already moving, her breath tight in her chest as she slipped out the front door. The night air was crisp, the artificial glow of the city stretching into infinity. A sleek, black transport hovered at the curb. The door opened as she approached. Adrian was inside. She hesitated. This was reckless. This was wrong. But then he met her gaze, and for some reason, she found herself stepping inside. The transport whisked them away into the neon-lit arteries of the city. Aura sat stiffly, unsure of what to say. Adrian, on the other hand, was utterly at ease, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Relax," he said finally. "I'm not kidnapping you." "That's exactly what someone kidnapping me would say," she muttered, and to her own surprise, he laughed. The sound was different than she expected, not sharp or mocking, but warm, unrestrained. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. The transport pulled to a stop in front of a towering structure of glass and steel. It shimmered with light, a monument to power and wealth. "This is the Solmere building," Adrian finished for her. "One of them, anyway." Aura swallowed. She shouldn't be here. And yet she followed him inside. The lobby was quiet at this hour, the usual crowd of high-ranking executives and wealthy elites nowhere to be seen. Adrian led her to a private lift, scanning his ID. As the doors slid shut, she finally turned to him, suspicion lacing her voice. "Why did you bring me here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back against the elevator wall, studying her. "You don't belong in that house." Aura stiffened. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm, certain. "They don't see you." "Not really." Her pulse quickened. "And you do." The elevator doors opened before he could answer. They stepped out onto a floor lined with panoramic windows, the city stretching out beneath them in a sea of golden light. But it wasn't the view that caught her breath. It was the garden. A rooftop ecosystem flourished here, an impossible oasis of alien flora and vibrant greenery. Bioluminescent vines curled around metal beams, casting soft glows in shades of violet and blue. A small artificial pond reflected the sky. It was breathtaking. Alive. Aura's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the petal of a flower that pulsed with gentle light. "These are Zalari plants," Adrian confirmed. "We imported them for a project my father was funding. No one really comes up here. It's just here." Aura turned to him, realization dawning. "You brought me here because—" Adrian met her gaze. "Because I thought you might need to see something familiar." Her throat tightened. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't pity. It was something else. A moment of silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Adrian exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I know what it's like to feel trapped," he admitted. "To be in a place that's supposed to be yours but never really is." Aura studied him, This boy of privilege and power who, despite everything, seemed just as lost as she was. She took a slow breath. "Then why do you stay?" He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I don't know where else to go." The words settled between them, quiet and heavy. For the first time since she had arrived on this planet, Aura didn't feel alone. She looked back at the glowing garden, at the small pocket of home Adrian had unknowingly created for her. Maybe she had hugged the wrong human that day. Or maybe, just maybe, she had found the right one. The city stretched out beneath them, a grid of golden veins pulsing with life, yet up here, in this sanctuary of glass and green, it felt distant, like a silent transmission from another world. Aura traced a fingertip along the glowing edge of a Zalari petal, feeling the gentle hum of energy beneath its surface. It was the closest thing to home she had touched in years. Adrian watched her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had brought her here, shown her something that should have been nothing more than an unused rooftop project, and yet it felt intentional, like a secret offered in the space between words. She turned to face him. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, he didn't answer. The distant hum of the city filled the silence between them. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, "Because I wanted to." It wasn't the answer she expected. She studied him, the boy who had everything yet carried himself like someone constantly walking the edge of a blade. His wealth, his status, none of it seemed to anchor him. Instead, it weighed on him like chains too finely crafted for most to notice. "You don't know me," she murmured. "You don't owe me anything." Adrian's gaze darkened, something flickering behind his eyes. "I don't owe anyone anything. That's the problem." She frowned, but he looked away before she could question it. Instead, he walked toward the railing, leaning on it as he stared down at the city. "My father, he doesn't believe in people. He believes in assets. Investments. If something, or someone, doesn't return value, it's discarded." Aura hesitated, stepping closer. "And you?" Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "What do you think?" The night breeze brushed against them, carrying the scent of metal and electric rain. She thought of her colony, the cold efficiency of survival, the way resources were assigned based on productivity. Not so different from what Adrian described, only wrapped in finer words. "You brought me here," she said finally, "not because of who I am, but because of what you aren't allowed to be." He stiffened, fingers tightening against the railing. For a moment, she thought he might deny it. Instead, he turned, eyes locking with hers. "Maybe." His voice was quieter now, raw. "But does it matter?" She wanted to say yes. That everything mattered. That this, whatever this was strange and reckless and had the potential to break them both in ways they didn't yet understand. But standing here, beneath a sky that never slept, in a garden that shouldn't exist, she couldn't bring herself to say it. Adrian reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, silver device. "Here." He handed it to her. "Encrypted comm link. If you ever need anything, you don't have to go through the school system. Just use this." Aura hesitated before taking it. The metal was cool against her palm. This wasn't just a tool, it was a tether. A line that connected them across whatever distance might come next. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't defiance or amusement. It was sincerity. "Thank you," she said softly. Adrian didn't smile, didn't offer some arrogant remark in return. He just nodded. Come on, I'll take you back before your host family decides to report me for abducting their exchange student." She didn't say it, but they both knew the Rains wouldn't care enough to notice she was gone. The transport ride back was quieter than before. Not uncomfortable, just filled with the weight of things left unsaid. When they reached the house, Aura hesitated before stepping out. She turned back to Adrian, suddenly uncertain. "Why did you really message me tonight?" For the first time, he looked as if he wasn't sure of the answer himself. His fingers tapped absently against the edge of the steering console. "Because when you left the spaceport," he said finally, "I realized I didn't want that to be the last time I saw you." Aura swallowed, her heart doing something strange in her chest. She stepped out into the night before she could think too hard about what that meant. The door shut behind her, the hum of the transport fading as Adrian disappeared into the darkness. She stood there for a long moment, the silver comm link still warm in her hand. Aura knew she should have stopped answering Adrian's messages. Every logical part of her mind warned against it, whispering that nothing good came from orbiting too close to a star too bright. And yet, each time the silver comm link chimed, she found herself responding before she could think better of it. At first, it was small things, a late-night message about an old Earth film he insisted she had to watch, a comment about how dull his father's latest business summit had been. Then, the conversations stretched longer. Hours passed in the glow of her screen, her room at the Rains house fading into irrelevance as she and Adrian spoke of places neither of them had been, of futures neither of them quite believed in. She told him things she hadn't told anyone here, about her colony's rigid expectations, about the way duty had been pressed into her like a brand. He listened, not with sympathy, but with understanding, as if he knew what it was to live beneath expectations so heavy they made it hard to breathe. And then, one evening, Adrian's name flashed across her comm with a message that made her breath hitch. "Meet me. No teasing. No pretense. Just that." Aura hesitated. The Rains family was in their usual state of indifference, locked away in their separate spaces. No one would notice if she left. Her fingers hovered over the device before she finally typed, "Where? I'll come to you." Minutes later, a familiar transport idled outside. She slipped into the passenger seat without a word. Adrian didn't speak either, but there was something restless in the way his fingers drummed against the wheel. Without waiting for her permission, he drove. The city lights blurred past them, their usual golden glow somehow sharper tonight, as if reality itself had drawn a blade against the sky. Finally, he spoke. "I did something stupid." Aura turned to him, brow furrowing. "What kind of stupid?" "The kind that pisses off powerful people." The transport turned sharply down an unmarked road, the towering spires of the wealth district giving way to older, forgotten parts of the city. The moment they stopped, Adrian turned toward her fully. "My father's been making moves. Big ones. Corporate expansion, trade negotiations, things I'm supposed to stay out of." His jaw tensed. "But I looked into something I shouldn't have." Aura's grip tightened against her seat. "What did you find?" He exhaled sharply. "A list of names. Companies my father's absorbed over the years, people who vanished when their businesses were acquired." A bitter laugh escaped him. "The official reports say they took their payouts and left for new lives. But the data says otherwise. The funds they were given? Never actually transferred." Aura's blood ran cold. "You're saying they—" "They didn't leave," Adrian finished, his voice grim. "They were erased." The weight of his words settled over them, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just corruption. This was something else. Something far worse. Aura swallowed. And you have proof of this? Adrian's expression darkened. Not enough. But I have enough to make my father very unhappy that I know about it. A silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to say out loud. Finally, Aura found her voice. Why tell me? Adrian hesitated. His fingers tightened around the wheel. Because you're the only person I trust. The words shouldn't have hit her as hard as they did. And yet they did. Aura exhaled slowly. This was no longer just about the strange connection between them. This was something larger, something dangerous. Okay, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. What do we do? Adrian let out a breath, one that sounded almost like relief. We figure out how to fight back. Aura nodded, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The storm had been coming for a long time. Adrian's father had built his empire on silence, on the unspoken threats woven into polite handshakes and the weight of credits transferred in the dead of night. But Adrian had shattered that silence. And now the consequences were here. They met at the edge of the city, in an abandoned docking bay where the shadows stretched long and the air smelled of rust and forgotten things. Aura stood beside Adrian, her heart steady despite the danger pressing in from all sides. Across from them, Malcolm Drake, the man who owned more than half the commerce routes in this sector, who could make or break entire industries with a single command, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look angry. He didn't need to. "You disappoint me, son," Malcolm said, his voice smooth, practiced. "You always have." Adrian didn't flinch. "I know." Aura could see the tension in Adrian's shoulders, the years of restrained fury bubbling beneath the surface. But this time, Adrian wasn't just standing in his father's shadow, waiting to be dismissed. This time, he had proof. "You built your fortune by making people disappear," Adrian said. "But you can't erase this." He raised his wrist, activating the small transmitter clipped to his sleeve. A pulse of blue light flickered through the space. And then voices. Archived conversations. Confidential reports. Testimonies from people who weren't supposed to exist anymore. Every corrupt deal, every cover-up, every silent threat his father had ever made, all compressed into data small enough to fit on a personal server, but devastating enough to bring down an empire. Malcolm Drake's expression barely changed, but the stillness in his gaze sharpened, like a predator recognizing a rival instead of prey. "You think this will change anything?" His voice was almost amused. "You think the people who matter will care?" Aura stepped forward before Adrian could answer. "They'll care once the right people see it," she said, her voice firm. "And they will. Because they hadn't come here alone." Somewhere in the distance, she knew the transmissions were already spreading. The data dump was live, sent to independent news circuits, corporate watchdogs, and figures of power that Malcolm couldn't buy off. Adrian had spent weeks preparing for this moment, making sure there was no single point of failure. Malcolm knew it too. For the first time, his mask of control slipped, just a fraction, but enough. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You've sealed your fate, Adrian." Adrian's voice was quiet, steady. "No. I've sealed yours." A long silence stretched between them. Then Malcolm exhaled slowly. "You're no son of mine." Adrian didn't look away. "You were never much of a father." And just like that, it was over. Malcolm Drake turned and walked away, his security detail flanking him like shadows. There was no shouting, no threats, just the quiet understanding that, this time, he had lost. Aura exhaled, the weight of everything settling over her. Adrian stood there for a long moment, staring at the place where his father had stood. Then, finally, he turned to her. "It's done," he said, almost disbelieving. "Yeah." Aura studied his face, the exhaustion behind his eyes. "Are you okay?" He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Not even a little." She reached out, hesitating only a moment before taking his hand. He didn't pull away. For the first time, Adrian Drake was free. And as they stood there, side by side, beneath a sky too vast to belong to any one person, Aura knew one thing for certain. Neither of them would ever be the same again.